something that, I mean, it's extremely timely, especially with the European Data Protection Board on 12th of May issuing some new guidelines regarding facial recognition technologies and the use of it in law enforcement. And especially as we're also seeing the use of AI that's beginning to proliferate a lot of European migration policies, especially. So this couldn't have come at a more timely sort of environment. And so without further ado, I'm very happy to give the floor to Patricia. And please feel free to post any questions that you might have in the chat, or we will definitely be taking questions after she finishes her talk. Thank you so much, everyone. Patricia, over to you.
Thank you, Pins. Pins and I go way back. We did a PhD together, so I'm not going to talk about how many years ago that was, but I mean, it's quite a lot of years. So I'm so happy that we reconnected for this occasion. And I also see that so many people that I know are here. So I feel really honored and even more nervous, especially I see some of my former students. And I think, you know, it's always nice to see when they continue their career in a path that you were teaching on. So that gives me an additional pleasure today. I'm going to start the presentation. So if you can just confirm once you see the screen, if that's now working.
Yes.
Okay, so you should see the beginning of the presentation. So I have to say, you know, a few caveats or a few disclaimers at the beginning, as we usually lawyers do whenever we do anything, including academics. So this is a topic that I'm very passionate about and something I'm also teaching on. Some of my students here, former students, will recognize the topic. It was one of our seminars. And I'm exploring biometrics in general when it comes to my teaching workload, but also I have started to research on the topic much more than in previous years. My origin, or the origin of my interest, comes from my work as head of legal in an IT company. I always like to start my talks like that. So where it originated was a very practical environment where I got to know different types of technologies and then deal with the regulative and legal part. One of these types of technologies that I dealt with was also AI/biometric data and the combination of it. So this actually topic is part of my series of topics that I'm researching, hopefully will publish in a few years. And as I said, while chatting with Guido at the beginning, I'm still a newbie in the area when it comes to the regulation and law. However, what I think I can bring in is the practical side that I have seen, and I like to explore the whole picture, the big picture of how to regulate biometrics. Now, I have tried to control myself while preparing for the presentation. I promise there will be no more jokes than this one, maybe one at the end. But it's very easy when you're researching such an area to have a lot of memes ready to make jokes, but I'm trying to be serious today. So I wanted to start, you know, as a tale and to kind of take you through different stages of what I like to call regulatory continuum when it comes to emotion sensing and affect sensing or affect recognition. So mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the happiest of them all? I just wanted to remind you of the story and how often human beings we like to get some external confirmation or approval, and I see from the psychological point of view that we are doing that more and more with machines. When it comes to machine learning, we are trying to create something that will resemble us, but at the same time, we are trying to ask those machines for feedback about ourselves as well. Now, a long time ago in Perfect Land, this is what a regulatory continuum would look like. So we would hopefully start with a design or concept of technology, and then we would sit down we would look at what we want to create, we would have ethical discussions around it, we would then create laws and regulations that would address those recognized concerns, and then we would release it into the society. Spoiler alert, this is not what we do every day when it comes to tech development and regulation of it. Usually what we are missing, or what we lawyers are not quite yet equipped to do, is to run together with the technological development. So what we get at the end, or ideally what we would get, we would have any part of the continuum that would trigger the other one. So we could start with the development of technology, using the society, then ethical discussions, and then law, regulation, readjustment, or we can start with the ethical discussions or the use, etc. However, this is not even the way I see the current situation when it comes to the regulation. This is more accurate what happens, and usually it starts with the use of technology in the society. Then we readjust the technology to address new functions, then we use it again, then suddenly we start thinking maybe we should regulate this, then we regulate it, then we recognize after the fact that there are a number of ethical issues that were not addressed because we did not understand it correctly. Then once we re-regulate it, we return to the society. Usually society also has a big influence on when regulation will be triggered through private actions, and then we readjust the regulation and we go in circles. So it's a one big mess, at least the way I see it. And that's why I would like to talk about the regulation of a very specific technology today, which is emotion detection or affect detection and intent detection. Now, I'm not an expert, and I'm not going to try to pretend that I'm an expert on this technology when it comes to technical knowledge. But what I do know, or what I would like to explain, is how everything functions in very, very simplified way. I'm not even trying to pretend that this is, there is a lot of background work with the development of this type of technology. But usually what we see as users is that we have a camera capture or any other biometric detection capturing device that gives a certain input of data. And then we have face detection or voice detection. We can also use a heartbeat when it comes to emotions. We can use also keyboard strokes and so on. So it's not just face detection, but I'm going to focus on face detection today because I think that's something that it's quite, first of all, we use it probably more than other types of biometrics detection devices, and also it's quite easy to understand and comprehend. After that, what follows is the process of features extraction, so the measurements of the face that are connected, that are then classified, and they are basically compared to a certain template that identifies an emotion that is felt at that moment. Now, the next slide is a bit freaky, but this is, for example, a template that is used by Disney when they're scanning the audience in a cinema, and they're trying to interpret their emotions and detect their emotions, and on that improve the movie or any product and so on. So this is, for example, a template that can be used and to what our faces, our measurements can be compared to identify. As you can see, they're mostly focused on smiling and laughing, joy or happiness, and that's only one emotion. Now, what I think it's important before I continue is to present how complex the technology is based on what they're trying to do. And I was thinking, what's the easiest way to do this? And in psychology, there is something that we call the wheel of emotions. This is just one version of it. Don't worry, you don't need to be able to read every single line. But what I can tell you, in the middle, you will see 7 basic emotions that are then divided in more in subgroups or sub-emotions, subtypes of emotions. So for example, if you say that you're angry, you can feel. It doesn't need to be only, it can be more quantifiable than that. You can be let down, humiliated, bitter, mad, aggressive, frustrated. And then each one of those emotions can actually be divided in more subtypes. There are different versions of this wheel of emotions. I just chose the one that I recently read or saw in a publication. But looking at this, it becomes very easy to see what is the complexity of what we are trying to do. And the question is whether we can actually do this effectively. If we cannot, what are the consequences for the society? What are the ethical concerns? And what are the main issues for regulation? So the way I teach and research and write about these topics is always by asking the question of how does this reflect in the society, in the world of ethics, and then finally, how do we solve this as lawyers? And that brings me to the first aspect of this topic, which is the social aspect or social implications. This is again very much a simplified presentation because we simply don't have much time to go through more details. But the way I teach and the way I research when it comes to the regulation of biometric data is by posing or introducing so-called privacy paradox. So when it comes to the use of any type of technology, including the technology that is based on emotion recognition and effect recognition, people, us human beings, we are driven mainly, or majority of us, by utility. And I know that for data protection lawyers, it's not very popular to have devices scanning your biometrics at home. And most of my colleagues here do not, or they refuse to use them. I'm not one of those. I like to say I have a social experiment at home. So I have also devices that are scanning different types of my biometrics. And if you ask me, why do I have them, or what do I use them for? Well, it's just convenient and entertaining. And it makes life easier sometimes. And I like to say, I'm using it as a social experiment, but to be honest, I'm just a consumer at the end of the day. So, well, we are driven by this utility, and we like to have convenient use of technology. We let it into our house. We use it every day. We provide this data, but by not thinking too much why and to whom. At the same time, we will expect legal protection. And this is the paradox that stems from the society. So we will, on one hand, use these technologies. On the other hand, we will expect the legislator to protect us from possible abuses, and we will talk about ethical concerns and legal issues. Now, when it comes to the use, I have so many examples, and I'm so happy that some of my students are here, because you know that this is one of the exercises that we are doing now. I'm doing for the second year. So every year I give a task when we are addressing this at the seminar to my students, to find the uses, different uses or applications of emotion detection and face recognition before the seminar. And we focus mainly on private entities providing this type of technologies. Every year there is some new device, some new application. And every year I just sort of expand the circle of uses or functions. So what often this is used for is, of course, marketing and general use. Especially big companies like to use emotion detection to know which products or which advertisements are to be offered to a particular user or consumer. Also, what is often used for is personalization or improvement of services and experiences. This is something that is being implemented in autonomous cars, especially, mainly not only for personalization, but improvement side, meaning security or safety of the driver and other passengers in the car. Also, what can this be used is, again, to adapt, for example, your playing list on Spotify that will suit your mood, or that will be a solution maybe for the mood you're currently in. Maybe if you're feeling down, they will try to cheer you up and so on. So it can be used for that type of goals. Now, this is something that where we started, but more and more this technology is finding its way, especially in mental and physical healthcare system, in order to, for example, identify people with dementia or depression, or to help understand or help autistic people understand other people working with them. And we are now stepping over that line where it becomes more and more sensitive what we do with this type of technology. The same goes for emotion regulation at work. So screening for usually how this technology is used is to improve the satisfaction of employees. But as I'm going to talk on the next slide, every advantage has its own disadvantage, its counterpart. In classroom use, it's used for teachers to get immediate feedback about emotions. I know there are many lectures here. I'm the first one who would not feel comfortable to receive constant emotional feedback from my students. And I think it goes vice versa. So, you know, when we talk about privacy and autonomy and dignity, these are all ethical questions I'm going to raise, whether we really want to be that exposed to the world. Also, it is used in the classroom to improve or to help students to spot the students that are struggling, following, and so on. And at job interviews, well, I'm not really sure what can be used except for the purposes of discrimination, but often it's something that is used to screen emotional reaction of the interviewee, and of course it influences the decision on employability as such. Now, as I said, most of these things can be very positive, and this is usually where the story starts. And as I said, I have the devices at home, so I'm not going to try to present only the negative side of the story, but for lawyers, not for consumers, it's important that we understand what are the possible issues. And the possible issues start with ethical discussions. So we have to ask ourselves, okay, these advantages or these uses are raising a number of ethical concerns that we then have to address through regulation, law and regulation, or see if we are addressing them, usually, hopefully they overlap, whether we are doing this effectively or whether we need to improve it. When it comes to data protection in general, and especially biometrics, one of the biggest ethical issues is function creep. Function creep, in simplest terms, means that data that is collected for one purpose is repurposed later on, or the function changes. So whatever lawful basis we had for the collection and processing of that data is no longer applicable because the function or the use of that data is changed. In the case of emotion detection, we can move from a personalization of services to potential surveillance or influence, for example, on people's choices. So it's a thin line between the first and the second use that we constantly have to be aware of. It also function creep happens, and I'm going to show that when I'm going to talk about the GDPR, when we do not characterize or qualify certain type of personal data as sensitive or special category of data, because that changes the whole regulatory framework for that type of data. And if with time that data falls into the special category of data, then the question is, what do we do now and how retroactively should we act? But I'm going to talk in more detail about that on the next slide. Then when it comes to discrimination, there are two layers of discussion, ethical discussion here. And yes, discrimination is something that is dealt with in detail in legislation as well. But we have to be aware that technology, first of all, when it comes to the application or effective application of the technology, there is a large potential for for discrimination, in the sense that depending on a sensitive characteristic, being gender, color of your skin, or age, this technology does not need to work equally effectively. So that's the first type of discrimination we can actually see when it comes to biometrics, and in this case, emotion detection. The second layer is, what do we do with the conclusions or with the data on emotions at the end? How is this data to be used? Does that mean if you go to a job interview and you're scanned and it is concluded that you're a highly anxious person, and I think all of us have been in that situation, and we all felt anxious to one extent or another, and the fact that some people are good at covering or masking that emotion, should that be the decision-making factor when it comes to the employment? Is it fair to use that data to decide whether the potential employer will employ or not? Not to go into the whole discussion about using emotion detection on children and so on, which complicates it further. Privacy and surveillance, something that you usually focus on, and dignity as well, all stems together and overlaps to an extent, and it talks very much about the autonomy of a person, and to what extent we should in principle allow such invasive technology scanning our bodies and making decisions or providing certain data based on that. But I think privacy is very much addressed through the GDPR and draft AIX. So that's my final point final part of the presentation. What do we have in law or regulation at the moment? And I'm going to focus on two main players in the field. One of them is the GDPR. The other one is AIX proposal, EU AIX proposal or draft. So when it comes to the GDPR, I have to say very disappointedly that the GDPR does not directly address emotion recognition. However, it does address certain relevant points where we can see whether such technology or such collected data would fall under the framework of the GDPR. I like always to start with the question, is it data? And I'm sorry that Rossana Ducato is not here, because usually she always says, it always is, Patrizia, it always is. But I like to ask that question because, we need to start from the start. So after that question, a more difficult or a bit more complex question is it personal data? Now, when we talk about the GDPR, personal data is defined as any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. And here what is also mentioned is that, for example, at the end, you will see mental state of that person, but it doesn't, when we talk about emotion detection, we do not always have a particular natural person attached to it, even though, and I'm going to talk about it on another slide, we do scan a natural person to get certain, first of all, biometric data based on which we, if you remember from the beginning, conclude on their emotional state. But whether we can actually trace back to that natural person and conclude or identify them, or whether it's identifiable, that depends on the process that is applied. So each process or each technology, each application would first need to be scrutinized through this definition, and whether it is possible to lead back to the certain natural person. Now, if we answer this positively, and as I started with explaining face recognition and taking face measurement based on that, concluding on the emotional state, the next question that we should ask ourselves, okay, if it's personal data, is it biometric data? Now, under the GDPR, biometric data is narrowly construed in the sense that that type of data, not only that it needs to relate to physical, physiological, and behavioral characteristics, as we know, but it needs to allow or confirm the unique identification of that natural person. And if we actually look at the process behind the motion detection, biometric data, which is certainly biometrics in technical sense, meaning that face measurements, for example, or voice pattern is taken from and analyzed, are being classified based on the template to detect emotional state of that particular person. So the use or the function is not to identify the person, but actually to identify the emotional state that person is. Again, each and every process needs to be scrutinized to see what the function is. Now, the question that necessarily follows, because in general, I do not agree with the approach of the GDPR when they are discussing the definition of biometric data, I am more inclined to talk about biometric in a technical sense, biometric data in a technical sense. So there is no need to identify the person, but it is, as long as it's connected to our physical, physiological, and behavioral characteristics, it should be considered biometric data as long as it meets these four criteria. All biometric data is universal, it's unique to a natural person, it's permanent, or it changes very slowly, and it's collectible. Now, if we look at emotional states, we can conclude that, of course, they are universal. That's why we can classify them in the wheel of emotions. They are collectible. However, the question is whether they're unique and whether they're permanent. The fact that we can classify them to that extent, that we have a wheel of emotions, does not necessarily mean that they're unique. Now, a heartbeat is unique, or face measurements are unique. But whether emotional state that is detected by analyzing them is unique is a matter of discussion. The same goes for permanence. Now, it depends how we define permanence. Does it mean that I have to be constantly in this state, or does it mean that the measurements or the template does not change to identify it? It's also questionable. So it's also a question whether emotional states are biometric data in technical sense. And then, of course, not only biometric data are protected specifically as a special category or sensitive category of data under the GDPR, other type of personal data, especially data concerning health. And in this case, we can already see that in some uses of emotion detection, this would definitely be met, can be considered sensitive or special category of data. Now, talking about, why am I talking about this? And I'm not going to go in detail, but what is important for those who have not studied GDPR to that level of detail, depending on the characterization of this type of data, you will get a certain level of protection. So if it's treated as a special or sensitive category of data, the level of protection will be much higher. Whereas if it's treated solely as personal data, in that case, the level of protection is a bit lower or much lower. And if it cannot be qualified as personal data at all, the GDPR will not apply. Leaving that aside and moving for the last part of the presentation, what does the draft or proposal AI Act of the EU bring new to this discussion? Well, first of all, at least they decided to mention emotion detection, so yay. To what extent that's effective, I have to say, when we were writing the response to consultations, we were quite critical of that part of draft AI Act. Now, why does it matter? Why is it connected with the discussion on the GDPR? Because it will link the definition of biometric data under the GDPR to the definition of biometric systems or identification systems under the draft AI Act. it will depend whether we consider emotion detection, biometric data under one act, whether we will consider it under the other act. And when it comes to biometric identification systems, real-time remote biometric identification systems, they are actually prohibited except for a list of situations when they can be used under Article 5 of Draft AI Act, which means if emotion detection will not be defined as such, it will be allowed, and then we need to go and see which type of risk this type of AI systems involve. I'm not going to go deeper into that. Where emotion detection is mentioned is in Annex 3, which deals with high-risk AI systems. Again, this annex, when AI system is identified as one of the high-risk systems, it will have a much higher level of legal, it will provide a higher level of legal protection. Now, when it comes to biometric identification, it is mentioned here again, it depends how we will define emotion detection, but where the act is specifically mentioning emotion detection is in point 6 of Annex 3 and point 7 when it comes to law enforcement, and when it comes to intent detection or detecting suspicious behavior, and when it comes to simply detecting emotional state of a natural person by law enforcement authorities. The same goes for migration management AI systems that are intended to be used by competent public authorities to detect emotional state of a natural person will be high risk AI systems. Now, it looks good. It is a step forward when it comes to the comparing to the GDPR, but what is overlooked is the use of AI emotion detection systems by private entities, which as such are not qualified as high risk AI systems, which means that the level of protection provided under the Draft AI Act is much lower. And what do I conclude at the end? Well, I don't have a conclusion as such, but I promised at least one more joke before we open the discussion. So what I see problematic is simply the complexity of the uses of different technologies and the data that are being collected for making such use effective and overall useful for the society. So again, coming back to my first slide, I think even if we did not do it properly and sat down and thought about these issues before, I think lawyers need to become more and more competent and more ready to run and address these issues in advance rather than to try to repair issues that arise after the regulation. Now, as I said, I'm at the beginning of the research, and I would very much like to hear your thoughts and questions.
Thank you so much, Patricia, for that really highly fascinating and enlightening presentation. I think you've shared a lot of things with us that are, these are things that are right now for thought, especially as we're seeing the transitions and the trajectories of the current AI Act. I think a lot of us are also recognizing that there's not enough in there in terms of biometric information. And the little loopholes, basically there are legal backdoors that might actually allow, still mass surveillance through biometric recognitions if these are not issues that are currently being addressed right now. I'm wondering if anyone has any questions to ask Patricia.